The mic is over there. Can it hear me? Can you hear me? I'm going to put the mic.
You want it to be facing you, I'm pretty sure.
So, welcome to the last workshop for taxonomic collectible card games. That's not what I wanted to happen. Today we're going to actually talk about how to design cards, right? Not how do you design an entire card game. That's kind of what we've been building out. We've been working on this entire time, but now, okay, we have a card game. How do we actually make cards to go into our card game? Any questions about what we're going to do?
Are we going to design cards?
No. As established at the beginning of the workshop, I wish we could actually do practice, but with the scope of this workshop, you have to practice this stuff on your own.
Yeah.
But also, there's only one of you, so maybe. Okay. So what are the objectives we're looking for in card design? If there's one thing I want you to take away from this workshop, it's that good card design is good game design. Right? Just because we're gone from working from game mechanics as a whole to working with just what is the actual text on an individual card doesn't mean we're not still doing game design. All the things we think about in game design and all the objectives we have in game design still apply. Right? We're still trying to make interesting dynamics and interesting game flows and give the players interesting decisions and do all of these things that we try to do in game design. Now we're just trying to do it instead of by doing it with the game mechanics, we're trying to do it with the actual content of an individual card. Right, so I've enumerated some things that you kind of want out of the card. Right, you want to create interesting gameplay moments. You want to make your cards simple and easy to grok.
What does grok mean?
Grok is a term that means like to understand, but to understand on a very deep level.
Grasp, completely?
Transcend.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. You're stuck here. You're the only officer in this room.
What?
We are leaving to the secret lab.
Cool. I have class soon. So. After this workshop, we've got time.
We'll
Okay.
probably come back if needed.
Right, you want to make your cards elegant, right? Try to use the tools already at your disposal well, as opposed to trying to add new tools. Explore your game mechanics, really try to flesh out them and all their interesting dynamics. Right, and then just enable really cool, interesting deck building by providing cards for cool, interesting decks. Any questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, misgivings about what we want out of a well-designed card?
No.
So first we're going to talk about card stats, which is kind of an interesting facet of what it goes into designing a card is what goes into actually making the stats and the numbers that show up on a card. Because they're a remarkably large part of card design. So why do we bother to put numbers on cards as opposed to just having cards be all text? For us as designers, making something into a stat provides us a really easy access to make interesting different cards, right? If we just have one little number that we can tweak on a card, we can make a whole bunch of different interesting cards just by tweaking that number a bunch of times. As opposed to having to completely reinvent the wheel every time we want to make a new different card.
So like the 1-cost guy who's a 1/1, and the 4-cost guy who's a 4/4, and then you tweak the 1-cost guy slightly, you turn one of his things into a 0, and then you give him a special ability. Or the 4 guy, you tweak him slightly, you change both of his things around, and then you give him a special ability.
Right. We've given ourselves easy knobs to turn to make different weird cool cards. For the players, they make the differences between what different cards do really easy to grok, right? It's a lot easier to just see to just be like, 9/9, hits for lots of damage, is powerful, as opposed to be like, having to read through like, this card deals 9 damage in combat, this card.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it makes it very obvious what's going on and easy to just look at the card at a glance and see what's going on, which is useful. It reduces the number of numbers your player has to memorize, right? If there's a rule in my game, at the start of my turn, draw 2 cards, right? Oh, now I need to remember the number 2. If I have a number that, whenever a player deals damage to a player, they deal 3 damage to that player. Well, that's a number I need to remember, right? Whereas, if every card had a big 3 on it, well, I don't need to remember the number 3. It's
on the card.
It's on the card, right? If I had an identity card that just says draw 2, well, I don't need to remember that I draw 2 cards. It says right on the card, draw 2 cards, right? And also, it makes your mechanics themselves easier to memorize, right? Like if I have a special mechanic that I have to roll some dice, well, if I have an attack power of 5, well, there's nothing to remind me that I have to go roll a dice to add on top of that 5. I'm just thinking, oh, 5, cool, got it. But if it's 5 plus 1 die, well, now I can't forget to go roll my 1 die, right? So it provides a useful memory aid in that regard. Also, your mechanics will just generally lend themselves to certain stats. And it's almost just easier to take those advantages, right? Like if a unit is dealing some amount of damage, that's just a stat in your game, or a mechanic in your game, it's almost just easier to just write that amount of damage on the card than try to come up with some other way to determine how much that damage is going to be.
Yeah.
Right?
Take the cost of getting it and then add 2. Just put 5 on it.
There are games that used to do that. Those games don't exist anymore, right? See Wyvern. Wyvern, I think, actually just straight up had that exact mechanic. It's like, how much damage does things do in combat? I think it was actually literally cost plus 2. Or was it the other way around, where things cost? No, it was the other way around, where everything costs its power plus 2. It's like, why don't you just write the cost on the card?
Yeah, it's just a little circle with a number in it.
Yep. So these are kind of where we come from the motivation of wanting to have cards stats. So we have ideas for what we want stats to be. What do we actually do with these, right? Well, the first obvious option is we just make it a stat, right? We just stick it on the card. However, usually speaking, we have lots of opportunities to make stats within a game, right? You can easily run into 6 or 7 different potential stats on any given card. They'll be doing 6 or 7 different things that could be stat worthy. And you often really only want about 2 to 4 numbers is about the right range for how many different numbers you want on a card, right? Like FFTCG has 2. Star Wars TCG has a lot. It has 5, right? Magic has 3. Netrunner has 2, right? This is kind of the sweet spot. L5R has 4, or 5, depending on which version, if they still have key or not.
1, 2, 3, 4.
And so
Vanguard's got about 4.
Yeah.
They're big numbers, though.
And so you can't really just every time you see, I want a stat, you can't really just afford to be like, all right, that's a stat now. Well, you kind of can. We'll talk about that in a minute. But generally speaking, you can. But if your number is really important and you want to emphasize it, this is probably the best way to go. You can also combine stats, right? If you have 2 stats that are generally in the same ballpark, right? Like if generally speaking, a creature can deal as much damage as it can take, maybe combine them and say, actually, it's just one number. It's your power. It's both how much damage you can take and deal, right? And if you want them to be different on one individual card, make it a special ability. It says this has this extra value when doing this thing, but not this other thing.
This has +5 value while attacking, and the other one has +5 value while defending.
Exactly. Right. This cuts down the number of cards on number of different numbers on your card. It can make things a lot easier to grok. can make things a lot less intimidating to look at. And it can provide just an intuition on how the different numbers in your game interact. So this is a pretty good option. And then last, you can just standardize a value. Right? You can just say all creatures have 3 health, right? All creatures deal 1 damage to players. That is an option to you. That has a lot of potential. It really can simplify things if done smartly, because it means that you don't need to think about different game states and different cards behaving differently. You just need to, you have one consistent rule about how things behave that you just need to remember, and that's it. And you never need to consider any weird quirks, right? You don't need to think about, oh, which creatures do I want to let through? They all deal 1 damage. You don't need to worry about that.
Yeah.
The flip side of that is you can get into scenarios where you get to like the Wyvern scenario of like your cost is your power plus 2 plus the number of gold, right? Where it's like that's really weird or annoying to remember, or Vampire TCG where everything has like 3 different stats and you have to remember what the default values are for all those stats. Helps that all the default values are either 1 or 0, but like still that's 3 different default values to remember for just 3 little numbers that you could have printed on the card. Or combine some of them and then printed even fewer numbers on the card.
Yeah.
So yeah, can really simplify things if you do it discerningly. Can make things weird and hard to remember if you don't. Any questions about kind of their motivation and the whens and the whys of making a card stat?
So 3 is a nice little sweet spot for most stats, right? That's like you said 2 to 4, so 3 would. Most games that I know of have around 3.
Yeah, you want around 3 stats.
Yeah. And if you have 3 stats, they only really have to remember 4 things because you have the 3 stats and the specifics tax, that card specific tax. So you got 4 things you got to remember about the dude instead of like 6.
Yep.
That's about it.
So yeah, that just happens to be a bit of a sweet spot. Any other questions?
Nope.
Cool. So, throw a wrench at this, the Bushiroad Approach. Bushiroad does some really interesting things with their card design. We're not going to talk about them too much. But one of the cool things they do with their card design is they kind of do this weird hybrid of the third approach and the first approach, where they just say, hey, is this a stat we could have? Cool, it's a stat we do have. This is one of their newer games called Luck and Logic.
It looks exactly like Vanguard.
They have a style. They have a decided style. This game has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stats. Anything that could be a stat is a stat. The flip side of that coin is 3 of these stats change in interesting ways. This stat has about 3 different options that it cycles through. This stat will change, and this stat will change. This stat always changes as a function of this stat and this stat always changes as a function of this stat, and this stat barely ever changes. So they really only have 3 stats.
They just threw a bunch of numbers on there.
They just threw a bunch of numbers on there because it's like they could change them if they wanted to, right? They would mean interesting things if they were to change. They
tend not to.
They just tend not to. So this approach kind of gives you if done right, this kind of gives you the best of both worlds.
It lets you have the simplicity.
We're going to forget that cards take up space because, well, there's how much space the card takes up. Right? You don't need to remember the equation for how much space a card takes up.
It tells you.
Tells you. But you also don't need to worry about thinking about how much different space every card takes up. It's a simple function of the level.
Yeah.
Right? That's cool. The flip side of this is your cards look like that. They're super busy. They have stats all over the place. And sometimes you get to a place like Cardfight Vanguard, where Cardfight Vanguard has a stat that has literally been the same on every single card printed. But it's printed on every single card. They've redesigned the frame multiple times and they've never bothered to remove the critical stat. But it's also always been 1.
What?
Exactly.
What if we want to make it 2? Okay.
They never decided to me. Yeah.
What does the critical stat tell you?
How much damage it deals to players.
Instead of making it a rule, you deal 1 damage. It's like, it deals 1 damage on every single card.
Yep. That's kind of the extreme of this approach.
Yeah, there's something like I kind of like about it is like, okay, I look at the card and I know what the card does. I don't have to go, wait a minute, what does this card do, and go look back at the rules for every single thing. I just go, oh, it does that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a nice little situation to be in. And looking at this card, they do it fairly well, even though it's busy. It's not, like the card is mostly art,
Mm-hmm.
but they still have room for all these numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So they do it pretty well.
It's a cool approach.
Yeah.
It has its advantages.
The trim of the card does not match the picture within, though, to a certain degree. Like I look at that trim and I think, okay, this is a mech battle game, and then I look at the art and I'm like, okay, this is not a mech battle game.
This is a sci-fi magical girls game.
Okay.
There are also Bushiroad just really likes intense sci-fi frames.
Mm-hmm. They look cool.
They do. Yeah, there are other cards from this game that justify the frame a little
I assume that that's just a fairly naturalistic character, and yes, it does not jive completely with the frame,
Mm-hmm.
but it looks cool.
Okay. Ready to move on?
Yep.
Cool. Here I just listed out some common stats because a theme of this workshop series is listing things, and this was the thing I could list. I don't think there's anything that interesting to be gleaned from this. It's just some ideas for like, hey, what stats could I stick on cards? Here are some ideas for what stats you can stick on cards.
Mm-hmm.
If you have questions, you can ask me. Otherwise, you can just read the list and we can move on. Cool. Cool. So let's talk about some actual approaches to designing individual cards. I think the most interesting revelation to have about card design is the idea that a card is a decision. Because as I mentioned earlier, but the really big take home that I want everyone to have about card design is that card design is game design.
Mm-hmm.
And well, what is game design? If you've been talking to me about game design for long, you'll know that one of my big things is that game design is all about decisions. So card design is obviously all about decisions, right?
Yeah.
A part of an interesting card is making sure that, the decision isn't just, do I put the card in my deck or not, and it's going to do this thing. Do I want it to do this thing? If I draw it, it's going to do this thing. It's actually giving you interesting decisions and lines of play to make while playing the game, right? Some cards are very explicit about this. I think the best example I can think of is the Magic card Gifts on Given, which is a very interesting, very explicit decision of AD.
Mm-hmm.
But also just a lot simpler cards that seem to do much narrower things can provide a lot of really interesting decisions.
And also, especially if the cards you have are similar in cost,
Mm-hmm.
then you're making the decision of which card to play at which point.
Exactly. Though that more comes in from the rules.
Yeah.
Now we're thinking on the level of not only do my rules allow me to make decisions, the individual cards themselves in vacuums allow me to make decisions. Right?
Yeah.
Without any of the rest of the game, how many decisions do you get to make off this card right here?
You get to choose when you play it, your turn, next turn. When it's your turn, you obviously have to pay the full cost. When it's their turn, you can take a black card and discard it from your hand rather than pay the spell cost. So you can, which is a nice little trick where you can get your mana down to 0, and then they would feel safe, and then you can pull this out, and they're like, oh, shoot. The battlefield this turn. Yeah, that is. And then you got those decisions, and then it just destroys everything that entered the battlefield. Dang, that's pretty powerful.
Are those all the decisions?
I assume not. It's instant. You can decide what point in the turn you play it. So if you play it at the end of the turn, at the end of their turn, you have all of their units that they're playing that turn. But if you play it before they attack, then all the units they were going. I guess all the units that with charge that they were going to attack with are now gone. I don't know. I guess I'm missing some.
Well, first of all, you get to decide which turn
Yeah.
you're going to play it on, right? Is this turn a big enough threat
Yeah.
that I'm going to take out all the creatures they played this turn, or am I going to wait for another turn where they might play more and more threatening things?
Yeah.
That's a really important decision right there. You also have the very interesting decision of which black card am I going to discard?
Yeah.
Which of one of these cards in my hand do I value the least? Right? Those are both decisions.
Or since it's black, which of these cards
Do I want in my graveyard?
do I want in my graveyard?
Except for its exile, yeah.
Oh, exile. Never mind.
Right? So that's like 3 decisions off of, at least, off of
One.
one little card,
Yeah.
right? And so, you can really cram in a lot of interesting decisions into some very elegant card design if you're thinking about
So like
cards as decisions.
the blue dragon from Eternal, that's a 4-cost, 4/3. You play it, and you turn a dude who costs 3 or less into a sheep or a goat. And when you do that, you have to choose when you're going to play it, because you need to select do they have a 3-cost dude who's worthy enough for me to put this dude out and transform. And then you have to choose which one of their dudes you have to do that to, and yeah, okay.
Yep. Good, well-designed cards are interesting decisions. We can think of cards as being explorations of our game mechanics, right? One of the cool things about card games is that we can make any card we want to, right? With enough rules text, you can make a card work however you want that card to work. You want a card that makes you go play a mini game of some completely different game, you can make it work in card text if you try hard enough, right? But that's not to say that some cards are going to be easier to make than others, right? Your mechanics are going to conducively lend themselves to certain cards and not to others. And part of good card design is really making the most mileage out of that really easy to design, my mechanics are going to help me space, because those cards are just inherently going to be more elegant, right? So one approach to card design is here of a rather actually complicated and nuanced interaction that, because it's just using 3 mechanics that already exist in the game, can be expressed in 2 lines of text.
Yeah.
Right? Because the game has this conception of key cost, because the game has this conception of what it means to be brought, or because this game has this conception of what it means to be damaged, you can really milk a lot of mileage out of that and make this kind of nuanced interaction of how much I get damaged, do you have to work harder.
Is that what is that? Is that a artifact?
Yeah, that's an artifact.
That's a pretty good artifact.
It is. It's rare. Right, so, either just by seeing what your mechanics are what easy mechanics you have at your disposal and just finding ways that you can plug one mechanic into another, do something weird, or outright exploits your mechanics and weird quirks to your mechanics that you can build entire cards around exploiting that quirk in your mechanics, can really allow you to get some very powerful cards with not a lot of text and do really cool things with them. And finding ways to do that is a very common and interesting approach to. Oh, and we've already moved on.
Absolutely. I got the last one.
Cool. So Another thing we can do with card design is we can say, well, here's this interesting thing in my world, or here's this interesting character in my world.
Mhm.
I want to represent this thing, right? And so, I mean, yeah, go ahead and read Sisei and tell me what you think Sisei is about as a character.
Having a bunch of different colors.
As a character in the universe.
Yeah. Search legendary permanent. Well, based on the picture, I would assume Sisei is an explorer. And I would assume she tries to find very powerful things. And as she finds more powerful things, she's able to find... As she finds more things, she's able to find more powerful things. And that's kind of the idea that I'm getting from her.
Mm-hmm. Very specifically, her shtick is that she goes around and recruits people, not things. But yeah, right. She's about building her team and finding her people. Yeah. And finding a diverse group of people, right? As represented by wanting to do a different number of things, right? And so the thing here is, this is kind of a weird, interesting, unique card, but it was born out of, well, not how do we do this weird, interesting, unique thing, it's born out of...
This is this character, how do we take this character and make it into a card?
Exactly, and that can kind of lead you to some really cool, quirky spaces.
Because she can get fairly powerful. Mm-hmm. And the more powerful she is, the easier it is, especially if you have all those color types, the easier it is to get really powerful things onto your field.
Right. And then, of course, feeding back into the theme of card design is game design. Remember that when you're doing top-down design is not about a literal representation of what this character is, right? Like Sisei, there's no reason in the story that Sisei has to go around and get the characters in order of increasing power. Yeah. There's no reason, and this card does not at all capture the idea that Sisei travels around, right? Which is a big part of her character. But it's about getting the essence of her character, the idea that she is the recruiter, she is the team builder, right? And so, remember that when you're doing a top-down design, don't get bogged down in the details, just focus on the essence. Any questions about why you might want to top-down design some cards?
Especially like later on, once you've already had like a Sisei card, and you have like the idea of who she is in your game world, and you're like, we want to make another Sisei card. It'd be cool if we had another one. That would be a good point to top down. Okay, what does Sisei do? How can we turn that into an interesting game mechanic?
This is actually the second Sisei card, so it exactly supports your example. Cool, moving on. So sometimes we're not just making cards because we want to, we're making cards because we have a purpose, right? Which is good. We like to be motivated in game design. We like to do things with a purpose, not just for shits and giggles. And so there's a lot of different reasons that you might want to make a card. You might have a motivation for making a particular card. Of course, whenever you have a choice, you always want to solve your problems with game mechanics, right? If you can solve your problem in your mechanics, it's going to be a much more robust, lasting solution that's going to do a lot more for you in the long run. But sometimes that's not an option, or you really have a niche problem that only needs a niche solution, or just the solution happens to be, the right solution just happens to be a very elegant card that you can use that will solve your problem. And in these cases, we're really motivated to make cards, right? We have a reason and a purpose to make a card. Right? Sometimes we just have a problematic card that we need an answer to. Sometimes a deck is just failing in one particular area and we need a card to patch that hole for that deck. Right? This card right here is motivated by the idea that, well, we have these two other cards who I can totally read.
Yuri
Yeah.
and Chronicle? Janica?
Something like that.
Yeah.
And we want them to be played together.
Yeah.
How do we encourage them to be played together? Well, give them a shared tutor.
One thing I noticed is that Final Fantasy Tactics, it's what it's called? What is it called? What's the name of the game? Final Fantasy...
Trading card game.
Yeah. Final Fantasy, this game has a lot of cards that go into your deck and find a card of this type.
Right.
Of 7 or name or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that very interesting. And I found it that makes sense from the EX burst and the backup situation of you want to be able to have this specific, you want to have the theme of Final Fantasy VII. So, hey, go get a Final Fantasy VII card. And this Final Fantasy VII card, it has other aspects about it that buff Final Fantasy VII cards.
That's a faction system, actually.
Yeah. It's like this weird... Yeah, it is a faction system of, hey, you hate each other in your game, but you're in the same game. So
and that's the faction. The faction is what game are you in, right? In addition to
color.
The game has multiple faction systems. Lots of games have multiple faction systems.
Yeah.
But yeah, right. That's a role that some cards just needed to do. Is they needed they had this role of we need things that can encourage you to play Final Fantasy cards together or Final Fantasy VII cards together. Let's make Jessie.
Yeah.
Right. That was right. Jessie wasn't made to explain the mechanics or to make an interesting decision. The Jessie does kind of make an interesting decision. Jessie was made to serve this purpose.
Get a card.
Yeah. Any questions about motivated card design and why we might make cards for individual purposes?
I also like how Ilaria's EX burst. So you get hurt and you're like, oh, Ilaria, now I can actually go and play the 2 cards that I wanted to play.
Mm-hmm.
It's a nice little mechanic. I like EX burst as a mechanic.
It's cool. It's in a lot of games for a good reason. Can we move on?
Yep.
Cool. So lastly, we're going to talk about the idea of a card design philosophy, right? The idea that card design doesn't happen on a card-by-card basis. It happens on a game-wide basis. So what is a card design philosophy and why do we want one? The idea is that in order to provide your game with a sense of consistency and to help keep the game balanced and in check and coherent, you don't want to think about how do I design this one card. You want to think about how do I design cards for this game? What is the approach that this game takes to making cards? Right, and we call this the card design philosophy of the game. Right, so every game you're going to kind of want to answer questions like, how do I do this? How do characters in this game deal extra damage? Do I have a stat for that? Is there a particular special ability I use for that? Does that get keyworded?
One thing I noticed in Eternal is most cards have a point value equal to about double their stat or their cost. So like a 1 cost card, he has 2 point value.
Right.
And then you take those point values and you can either attribute them to health, damage, or special abilities. And so all cards tend to have a set point value, which I thought was very neat.
And that is part of...
Yeah, that's their design philosophy. We're just going to have these point values, and so every single card is worth about what they cost.
Yep.
And it ends up with fairly big cards, like compared to Magic, but
then again, that's part of the...
yeah. And then every once in a while there's a card that's like, does it make sense? Like Moonstone Colossus, it's a 5/5. It costs 5. It has like 3 abilities. But those are the rare ones. And
It's pushing.
yeah.
The term for that is it's push.
Yeah.
Which we can go on a tangent about, but first I want to finish this.
Yep.
right? You also kind of just want to think about what abilities are important for your game, right? What abilities do you want lots of cards to have? What ability do you not want lots of cards to have, right? Like the really salient example here, which we've already brought up, is searching your deck, tutoring, right? Some games like Final Fantasy have lots of tutoring, right? They will let you tutor and tutor and tutor more and more cards, right? Like, you know, Final Fantasy, every single Final Fantasy game gets its own tutor, plus other tutors, right?
And it's very important that you get access to the cards you want, because most of the interesting decisions come from having this one card.
And so that's a really big part. And those tutors tend to be fairly cheap, right? Like 3 CP.
Yeah. Also, you tend to have a big deck in Final Fantasy Tactics, and repeated cards tend to not be.
Game.
Or
Tactics is a different game.
Final Fantasy TCG, and repeated cards tend not to be quite as useful as in other games due to the legendary status of old dudes.
You also, right? So that's part of their design philosophy. Is tutoring is good. Let's do lots of tutoring. If you look at other games, for example, Eternal is like one tutor in the entire game. Right? You have like Wish Upon a Star, and then
you've got some. Look at the top 5 cards of your deck. A bunch of those, but those tend to either take the other cards and put them at the bottom of your deck, or discard them, which you're paying a fairly hefty price as in all the other cards that you were looking at. Or
no, you're not.
Huh?
No, you're not.
What?
Those cards might as well have been on the bottom of your deck the whole time.
Yeah.
There's no cost. You still get 5 more cards.
The discard ones, the ones where you discard cards.
No, again, they might as well have been on the bottom of your deck.
No.
And I'd rather have cards in my discard on the bottom, right? Because they can interact with my discard.
Okay.
It
feels like a price.
It feels like a price, yes. That is correct. Though it actually technically isn't from an objective strategy standpoint, which is a very interesting thing to play with in card design. Is the things about losing cards that feel like prices that aren't.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a tangent. Right? So like that's part of Eternal's design philosophy is we don't tutor. We search out for top 5 cards of the deck. Right? These are 2 different design philosophies for 2 different games, and you need to find for your game where is the right design philosophy for your game.
There are technically a couple cards that tutor power cards, or whatever they're called.
Yes.
But they don't. They just take the top one.
Yeah, exactly. That's not even really a tutor.
Yeah. Which is a nice little ability because it simultaneously gives you power, and it also removes power from the top of your deck.
Yep. You also have. What was I gonna say? So yeah, right. You also with this, I forgot to put this question on the slide, but it really should be there. Just how much raw stuff can one card get done? Right, is an interesting question. Right, like you have games like Force of Will where any one card can really swing the game, and the game has to be very powerful, and things can luck tends to happen from turn to turn, right? Because the cards are just allowed to do a lot. Or you have games like Magic the Gathering where cards are very much not allowed to do a lot, and things tend to be very slow and deliberate and plotting. Because one card really can't do that much on its own.
Yeah.
That they're very restricted on what they're allowed to do, right? You know, in Force of Will, like I play, 3 mana, so like turn 4-ish. I get a giant dragon that's a giant dragon, and it's gonna wreck your board. Magic, turn 5 or 6, I get a giant dragon. What does it do? It's just a giant dragon.
It kind of sucks.
Yeah, right. And it's just a difference in card design philosophy of how much should one card get done. Also, you should think about it like, should certain things tend to come together, right? Like a very common one is the idea of answers. Should answers just be answers, or should answers advance the game state, right? You'll notice that like in Magic, you tend to get a lot of counterspells that are just counterspells. They just counter a spell. That's very common in Magic. Where in Eternal, if you're gonna get a counterspell, most counterspells will also advance your game state. Build like Counterlash, the most common counterspell in Eternal, deals damage, right? The idea is, well, we're trying to we don't think just counterspelling is interesting. We think counterspelling should also do something else.
And it also can happen on like both sides. Is some of the ones that block stuff, they block the thing and hurt the opponent. Some of them, the things that block stuff, they block the thing and hurt you.
Yep.
And so it's still either way advancing the game state.
Mm-hmm. So that's another interesting difference in like design philosophy is, what should certain effects always come with other certain effects, or should they be allowed to stand on their own? And if so, which other certain effects should they come with?
And is it possible to have enough cost on a card that it loses the other effect that's decreasing it? So like, there's 2 dark cards. They're basically the same thing. One costs 2, one costs 4.
Mm-hmm.
One can only target people who have 1 alignment. The other one can target anyone, and they just kill them.
Yep.
And that's a very interesting choice. Maybe not in gameplay, but in deck building of, hey, which one of these do I want to throw in there? I'm pretty sure one's a fast spell. Are they both fast spells? I don't know.
Maybe they're both fast spells. Yeah. So that's card design philosophy. Any questions?
No.
Cool.
I assume there's several design philosophies that you can get.
Every game has its own design philosophy, right? You don't pick one, you
Come up with it.
Yeah, right. You figure out what's the right design philosophy for your game.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's the end of my slides.
Cool.
You mentioned pushing, so we can talk about pushing.
Pushing is, here's the design philosophy. This one doesn't really fit in the design philosophy? Or,
No.
okay.
Pushing is a broad game design concept. It shows up a lot in card design, but it shows up in all of game design more generally a lot.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of pushing is you want your players to do a particular thing, so you balance the game in favor of that thing.
Okay.
Right? Like you say, hey, here's a really fun sword, I want you to play with this sword. Well, maybe we'll make this sword deal a little more damage than would otherwise be considered balanced to encourage you and reward you for playing with this sword. That's the philosophy of pushing, right? It's abusing your balance to encourage players to do particular things.
That's cool.
Pushing is very important.
I hate to always bring it back to Dark Souls, but Dark Souls as a series has done a lot of pushing. By switching up like which mechanics are viable in individual games. They're like, because like in the original ones they had just a lot of ways to interact with every single situation, and they're like, okay, now we're going to focus on this way of interacting with every single situation. So you still kind of have the other ways, but this way works better than the other ways. And it's a very interesting.
Yep, that's the basic idea of pushing.
Yeah.
Right, it's just a way of encouraging your players to do the fun things. So yeah, and so that shows up in card design, right? Because if you have a card that you think is really cool and fun to play with, push it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe cost it a little more aggressively, make it a little kind of OP, just to encourage players to play with it, because you think it's a fun card to play with and you want players to play with it. It wouldn't matter if you made the best card in the world if it's just not powerful enough to ever see play.
Yeah.
No one's gonna really benefit. So that's why pushing that. Any other questions, comments, concerns about card design?
Flintstone Colossus is just ridiculously overpowered. It's hard to get it, but like it draws a card on attack. It's what's the term? Endurance, and on defense it heals you. And it's just like, yeah, throw me out, and I can deal with most situations. They have to attack you with people stronger than this dude, or you just heal.
Yep, it's
It's one of my favorite cards.
That's cool.
I made also it's pledge, it's endurance, it's a whole bunch of stuff, and it only costs 5, which is fairly expensive, but not that bad. Especially when you mix it with the clock roach, that reduces pledge cost dudes. That's currently my deck. Basically those 2 guys, and well, a bunch of other pledge dudes, like the 5 cost pledge dude who's got flying and indestructible.
Oh yeah.
Wait, I don't have any silence cards currently, and I don't have any insta kill cards. He's indestructible. He's like a perfect wall. My favorite.
Harsh rule.
Huh?
Harsh rule.
Yeah.
Wait, does harsh rule hit indestructible?
If you kill him, he dies. He just can't take damage.
Ah.
So anything that instantly kills him, anything that silences him, he can be stunned.